Marcus Bennett walked into the Oakview branch of Sterling Trust Bank holding an $8 million check in one hand and his 9-year-old daughter's fingers in the other. Vanessa Kessler looked at the check, looked at his faded work boots, and tore it into 4 pieces before he could say a single word. "Men who look like you don't walk in here with checks like this," she said, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. Marcus knelt down, pulled his daughter Zoe close, and told her softly that the woman behind the counter had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Then Vanessa picked up the phone and called the police to report a fraud in progress. Security began moving toward Marcus when the branch door swung open, and the regional president of Sterling Trust walked in, saw the torn paper scattered on the tile, and went pale. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice suddenly shaking, "what happened here? Before the story unfolds any further, if this kind of moment hits close to home for you, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what happens next." Now, rewind 3 hours. Back to a quiet street in Cedar Falls, where the morning had started like every other morning of Marcus Bennett's life. Marcus was 44 years old, and for 6 years he had raised his daughter alone in a modest brick house at the edge of town, the kind of house nobody looked at twice. His wife had left when Zoe was 3, chasing a different life in a different city, and Marcus had simply kept moving forward because stopping was never an option he allowed himself. Every morning he made her breakfast, drove her to school, and never missed a single dance recital, even on the mornings after nights spent awake until 4 building spreadsheets nobody in Cedar Falls knew existed. None of the parents at Zoe's school knew that the quiet man in the faded flannel jacket had built Bennett Legacy Partners from a card table in his garage into a firm managing $9 billion in assets. Marcus liked it that way because he refused to let his daughter grow up thinking a person's worth could be measured by the price tag on their jacket. He wore the same watch he had worn for 12 years, drove a 10-year-old pickup truck with a cracked side mirror, and kept his success folded quietly into the corners of an ordinary life. That particular Tuesday morning, a check for $8 million had cleared into his account, the payout from an early stake he had taken in a biotech company most people had never heard of until its drug hit the market. Marcus already knew exactly where the money was going, before the ink on the check had even dried. $4 million would go straight into a trust for Zoe's future, untouched until she was old enough to understand what her father had built. The other $4 million was meant to seed a new scholarship fund for children being raised by a single mother or a single father, the kind of family he understood in his bones, because he had lived every exhausted, sleepless version of it himself. He brought Zoe along that morning because they had a plan for the rest of the day, one she had been chattering about since the moment she woke up. First the bank, then the bookstore, then dinner at the diner on Clover Street, where she always ordered the same waffle with extra strawberries. It was supposed to be the easiest stop on their list, a 5-minute formality before father and daughter went back to being father and daughter instead of founder and dependent. Neither of them expected the visit to take longer than 10 minutes, and Marcus had already promised Zoe she could pick out 4 books instead of her usual 2, since he was in an unusually good mood. They walked into the Oakview branch of Sterling Trust Bank a little before closing, the same branch Marcus had used for 18 years, since long before Bennett Legacy Partners had a name anyone outside a small circle of investors recognized. The woman behind the manager's desk that afternoon, Vanessa Kessler, had transferred to that branch only 3 weeks earlier and had never once pulled up his account. She had no idea the man standing in front of her in a flannel jacket had been depositing paychecks into that very branch since before her own banking career had even started. Vanessa's eyes swept over Marcus the moment he stepped through the door, dropped down to Zoe, then flicked out toward the dented pickup truck parked at the curb. 2 other customers who walked in wearing pressed suits were greeted by name before they had even crossed the lobby. Marcus and Zoe stood at the counter for nearly 10 minutes, while 3 tellers stayed conveniently busy with paperwork that did not need doing. Zoe tugged at her father's sleeve and asked quietly why nobody was helping them yet. Marcus told her gently that it never paid to assume the worst about people before they had actually done anything to earn that assumption. When he finally reached the counter, he placed the check down and asked for it to be deposited into the account he had held for nearly 2 decades. The number on the check caught the teller's eye immediately, and within seconds, Vanessa herself was standing behind the counter, her arms already crossed. Instead of pulling up his account history, something any manager could have done in under 30 seconds, she began interrogating him about where the money had come from, her voice climbing louder with every question. Marcus answered every single question without raising his voice or losing an ounce of his composure. He handed over his driver's license, his account number, his business card, and the notarized paperwork confirming the sale of his shares. He even offered to let Vanessa call the issuing bank directly so she could verify every detail herself in less time than it would take to finish her coffee. It was, by any reasonable measure, more than enough documentation for a transaction that should have taken 5 minutes from start to finish. Vanessa glanced at the papers without actually reading a single line of them. "A man carrying $8 million doesn't drive a truck like that," she said, loud enough that heads turned across the lobby. A young teller named Melissa Ortiz offered to make the verification call herself, but Vanessa cut her off before she could even reach for the phone, ordering her back to her station in a tone that ended the conversation instantly. By then, several customers had noticed the tension building at the counter, and more than a few had already pulled out their phones to record. One man standing near the entrance said, loud enough for Zoe to hear clearly, that a man like Marcus was probably using his own daughter to make a scam look more convincing. Nobody in that lobby said a single word against the comment. They simply kept their phones raised, waiting to see exactly how far this was going to go. Zoe's small hand found her father's and gripped it so tightly her knuckles went white, all the earlier excitement about the bookstore draining out of her at once. Marcus kept his voice level and asked Vanessa one final time to simply place the verification call before this went any further than it already had. His calm only seemed to provoke her further. In front of the tellers, the security guard, and every customer still filming, Vanessa announced to the entire lobby that the check was fraudulent, despite never having verified a single detail of it. Marcus reminded her, evenly and without malice, that she was handling a customer's legitimate life savings and should think very carefully about her next move. Vanessa heard that reminder as a threat instead of the warning it actually was. She snatched the check off the counter, stared directly into Marcus's eyes, and told him that people like him simply did not walk into her branch with $8 million. Then she tore it in half, then into quarters, then let the pieces flutter down onto the tile floor at his feet, directly in front of his daughter. The entire lobby went dead silent. Zoe bent down as if to gather the torn pieces herself, but Marcus stopped her gently, refusing to let his little girl kneel on the floor to collect what someone had just used to humiliate him. He looked directly at Vanessa and told her, without ever raising his voice, that she had just made the single most expensive mistake of her career. Vanessa immediately called the police, telling the dispatcher that a man was attempting to pass fraudulent documents, threatening staff, and refusing to leave the premises. She then ordered Diego Reyes, the branch's security guard, to escort Marcus out of the building immediately. Diego hesitated before stepping forward, unsure why he was being told to remove a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter, but a direct order from a manager left him little room to argue in front of a lobby full of witnesses. Zoe looked up at her father as the guard approached, her eyes wide with a fear no 9-year-old should ever have to carry into a bank on an ordinary afternoon. Marcus tightened his grip on her hand and kept his voice low enough that only she could hear him promise everything would be fine as long as she stayed close. He understood exactly what position he was in. He could resist and risk turning a bad situation into something dangerous with his daughter standing beside him, or he could stay calm and let the truth catch up to the moment on its own time. He chose not to fight the order, but he also refused to walk out that door before someone confirmed what he already knew to be true. He glanced down at the torn scraps scattered across the tile, the remnants of a scholarship fund that had not even had the chance to exist yet, and felt something harden inside his chest that had nothing to do with anger. It felt closer to certainty than rage. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, this had stopped being about an $8 million check and had become about every single assumption a room full of strangers had made about him before he ever opened his mouth. He held on to that thought as Diego's hand settled lightly on his arm and let himself be walked slowly toward the door, one measured step at a time. Zoe pressed tightly against his side. Diego's grip stayed light as they moved toward the glass doors, but Zoe could not stop glancing back at the torn pieces of the check still scattered across the floor. She wrapped both arms around her father's waist, pressed her face into his side, and begged the guard in a small, trembling voice not to take him away. Diego's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, caught somewhere between a manager's order and the plain evidence sitting right in front of his own eyes. Vanessa called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to hold Zoe back so the girl could not, in her words, obstruct an officer of the bank from doing his job. That was the first moment Marcus's calm actually cracked. He had absorbed the accusations about the check, the insults about his truck and his jacket, even the humiliation of watching his own money torn apart in front of strangers. But the instant someone suggested laying a hand on his daughter, his voice changed entirely. He told the teller, in a tone that left absolutely no room for negotiation, that no one was to touch Zoe. Vanessa seized on that reaction immediately, telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity was proof of exactly the aggression she had been warning everyone about since he first walked through the door. Marcus understood in that instant that every word out of his mouth and every motion of his body was being filtered through a lens that had already decided who he was long before he ever said a word. He lowered his voice, kept his hands visible at his sides, and pulled Zoe in close enough that she was pressed against his hip rather than anywhere near the guard escorting them out. It struck him, standing there, how quickly a father's instinct to protect his child could be twisted into evidence against him. He had spent 6 years building a life where Zoe never once had to see him lose his composure, and now a stranger behind a bank counter was rewriting that same protectiveness into something dangerous simply because it suited the story she had already decided to tell about him. Melissa spoke up again, the second time she had tried to intervene since the confrontation began. She reminded Vanessa as steadily as she could manage that Marcus had not threatened a single person and that one phone call to the issuing bank would settle the entire matter within minutes. Vanessa turned on her instead, threatening to fire her on the spot if she said another word out of turn in front of customers who were still recording every second of it. Melissa did not back down completely, but she stopped talking, aware that losing her job would help absolutely no one standing in that lobby, least of all the man beside his frightened daughter. She glanced at Marcus for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she believed him completely, even if she could not say so out loud without risking her own position. Melissa had only worked at that branch a little over a year, and she had watched Vanessa dismiss more than one customer in ways that never quite sat right with her conscience. She had told herself each time that it was not her place to speak up, that questioning a manager risked more than it was worth. Standing there, watching Zoe's face crumple, she understood that whatever she had told herself before no longer held up under the weight of what she was witnessing. The customers recording on their phones kept right on recording. Nobody lowered a phone to speak up, and nobody stepped between Vanessa and the family she was dismantling in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. They wanted the spectacle, but none of them wanted to be the first person to risk anything by standing on the side of a stranger they had never met before that day. Zoe looked around the lobby, at all the raised phones and lowered eyes, and asked her father, in a voice just loud enough to carry, whether anyone in the room would say he had done nothing wrong. Several people looked away the moment she said it. Nobody answered her, and nobody moved a single inch. Marcus felt that silence settle into his chest, harder than anything Vanessa had said, because he understood, watching his daughter's face, that she was learning something about the world that no 9-year-old should have to learn inside a bank lobby on an ordinary afternoon. He realized, standing there with Zoe's hand locked in his, that this had stopped being only about $8 million, or even about his own dignity. His daughter was watching an entire room agree, through nothing but silence, that an injustice happening in plain sight did not require anyone to actually do anything about it. That thought settled into him with more weight than the accusation of fraud ever could, and he found himself wondering what kind of lesson Zoe would carry out of that building if nothing changed before they reached the door. Diego kept walking Marcus and Zoe toward the glass doors at the front of the branch, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder rather than gripping it, as though some part of him did not want to be doing this even while he did it. The lobby had gone quiet, except for the murmur of customers still filming, waiting to see how the scene would end, and the low hum of overhead lights that suddenly seemed far too loud. Marcus counted his steps toward the door, the way he sometimes counted his breaths during a difficult negotiation, a habit that kept his mind from racing ahead into anger. Zoe's small hand stayed locked around 2 of his fingers, and he could feel her trembling even though she had stopped crying somewhere in the last minute. He told himself that whatever happened next outside those doors, the only thing that mattered was that she stay close and stay calm, and everything else could be sorted out afterward. Vanessa watched them go with her arms crossed, apparently satisfied that the matter had been handled correctly, completely unaware that the man walking toward the exit held more influence over her branch's future than she could have imagined 10 minutes earlier. At that exact moment, the door swung open, and Richard Callahan walked in, a leather briefcase in one hand and the unhurried posture of a man expecting a quiet, uneventful late afternoon meeting. Richard was the regional president of Sterling Trust Bank's Eastern Division, and he had come to the Oakview branch specifically to meet Marcus after hours, away from the attention a public meeting might draw. The two of them were finalizing a deal worth $900 million between Sterling Trust and Bennett Legacy Partners, a deal that had taken the better part of a year to negotiate and was scheduled to close within the week. Richard took 2 steps inside before he understood exactly what he was looking at. Marcus Bennett, the man he had been preparing to meet for the better part of an hour, stood with a security guard's hand on his shoulder while his daughter clung to his side in tears. Scraps of paper were scattered across the floor near his feet, and Richard did not need anyone to explain to him what they had once been. His briefcase slipped out of his hand and landed with a heavy thud against the tile. For a moment he simply stood there, processing the distance between the meeting he had walked in expecting and the scene actually unfolding in front of him. His eyes moved from the torn paper to Zoe's tear-streaked face, and then finally to Marcus himself. Then he said the 2 words that changed the entire temperature of the room. "Mr. Bennett," Richard said, his voice carrying across the lobby with an authority that made every single head turn. Diego released Marcus's arm immediately, stepping back, as though the shoulder he had been holding had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Vanessa moved toward Richard and began explaining quickly that she had just prevented what she believed was an $8 million fraud attempt. Richard looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment before asking whether she had any idea who the man standing in front of her actually was. Vanessa opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, realizing for the first time that the question had not been rhetorical. She glanced at Marcus, then at Zoe, then back at Richard, searching for some version of the last 10 minutes that might still make sense in light of what was happening. Around the lobby, the customers who had spent the last several minutes recording a supposed criminal suddenly lowered their phones just enough to exchange confused glances with one another. "Wait," a woman near the entrance whispered to the man beside her, asking if this meant the whole thing had been some kind of horrible misunderstanding. Nobody answered her, because nobody yet understood exactly how large that misunderstanding actually was. In front of every customer still standing in the lobby, Richard explained that Marcus Bennett was the founder of Bennett Legacy Partners, one of the largest institutional clients Sterling Trust currently held. He explained that Bennett Legacy Partners was in the final stages of a $900 million agreement with Sterling Trust, and that Marcus was the only person alive with the authority to approve or walk away from that deal. The $8 million check, he added, was entirely legitimate, and the issuing bank had sent formal confirmation early that very morning, a confirmation Vanessa had never once bothered to check before deciding what she believed about the man standing at her counter. Richard then turned to Zoe, lowered himself down to her eye level, and apologized to her directly for what had happened inside a bank that carried the Sterling Trust name on its letterhead. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time since they had walked through those doors that anyone in the building had spoken to Zoe as though her fear actually mattered, and she looked up at her father as if checking whether it was finally safe to believe him. 2 words had been enough to reverse the entire room. The customers who had been filming lowered their phones, though none of them deleted the footage still sitting in their pockets. The tellers who had stood frozen behind the counter began exchanging uneasy glances, several of them suddenly finding reasons to look busy with paperwork instead of meeting anyone's eyes. Vanessa, for the first time since the confrontation began, had nothing immediate to say. The man near the door, who had loudly accused Marcus of using his own daughter to sell a scam, now stood studying his shoes, making no effort to apologize or even meet Marcus's gaze. Zoe noticed him too, and Marcus felt her grip tighten slightly on his hand, as if she recognized the voice even without looking directly at the man who owned it. Vanessa straightened her blazer and cleared her throat, as though composure alone might undo the last few minutes. She recovered quickly, though, and rather than accepting responsibility, she insisted that Marcus bore some blame for the entire incident himself. She argued that a man carrying $8 million should have dressed the part, or, at the very least, identified himself the moment he walked through the door, as if the burden of preventing his own humiliation had rested on him rather than on her. Marcus asked her, without raising his voice, whether a customer needed to be wealthy or well-known before he deserved basic decency. Vanessa answered by insisting she had only been following procedure, repeating the word twice, as though saying it often enough might somehow make it true. Richard gestured toward the torn paper still scattered on the floor, and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his own child. "There is no such procedure, Vanessa," Richard said flatly. "There never has been." Vanessa's face flushed, and she started to say something about protocol again before catching herself, aware that the word had already failed her once. She fumbled for an answer and found none. She looked around the lobby at the tellers, who would not meet her eyes, and the customers still holding their phones, and, for the first time, seemed to understand that no one in that room was going to help her out of the corner she had backed herself into. She could not answer Richard's question, so instead, she pivoted again, this time blaming Marcus for bringing his daughter into the bank at all, suggesting that Zoe's presence had made the entire situation more emotional than it needed to be. That comment was the exact moment Marcus stopped extending her any benefit of the doubt whatsoever, and something in his expression made even Richard take half a step back. Richard ordered Vanessa to surrender her employee badge and her keys immediately, and instructed her not to touch her computer or her phone under any circumstances. Every file and every note attached to her station that day would be preserved for a full internal investigation, he told her, in front of everyone still standing in the lobby, his voice carrying the flat finality of a decision that would not be reversed by an apology. While attention remained fixed on Marcus and Richard, Vanessa quietly slipped behind her terminal and attempted to delete an internal note she had added to Marcus's account only minutes earlier, one describing him as a threatening customer with a high risk of fraud. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, as though she believed the whole matter could still be cleaned up if she acted fast enough. Melissa noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye, and crossed the lobby before Vanessa could finish, placing a hand firmly over the keyboard and stopping the deletion mid-motion. She told Vanessa plainly that the note needed to stay exactly where it was, then turned to Richard and informed him that the branch's security cameras had recorded the entire incident from multiple angles, including the exact moment Vanessa tore the check apart in front of Zoe. Vanessa's face went pale at the mention of the cameras, as though she had forgotten entirely that the whole exchange had been captured on film from the moment Marcus first walked through the door. Richard terminated Vanessa on the spot, right there in the lobby, in front of the same customers who had watched her tear the check apart less than 10 minutes earlier. Vanessa asked to have the conversation privately in an office instead, but Richard refused her outright. He told her plainly that she had humiliated Mr. Bennett in public and that she would answer for it in front of the same people who had witnessed it happen, not tucked away behind a closed door where the consequences might quietly disappear. Turning to Diego, Richard took a more measured approach. He acknowledged that the security footage showed Diego had never once used force against Marcus and had released him the instant Richard spoke, and he suspended Diego pending a full review rather than terminating him outright, telling him the time off would give both of them a chance to look at the footage clearly before deciding anything permanent. Diego's shoulders dropped with something between relief and shame. He admitted quietly that he should have questioned Vanessa's order the moment it was given, instead of following it simply because it came from someone above him. "I knew something felt wrong," he said, mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust that feeling enough to say so out loud." Marcus, still holding Zoe against his side, found he had no anger left for the guard, who had at least had the decency to hesitate before every step, unlike the woman who had ordered him to act. The police arrived not long after, responding to the call Vanessa had placed earlier, describing a black man attempting fraud and threatening staff. 2 officers walked in, scanning the lobby, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt the same tightening in his chest he had felt when Diego's hand first landed on his arm, a reflexive bracing for another round of assumptions, before anyone had even asked him a single question. Richard tried to explain that the initial report had been false, but the responding officers still had to file an incident report, since Vanessa's original call had already been logged as an official complaint before anyone corrected the record. One of the officers apologized for the inconvenience while taking down Marcus's account of events, admitting under his breath that the dispatch call had made the situation sound far more serious than what they were actually seeing in front of them. Marcus stood through the questioning with Zoe still pressed against him, answering each question calmly, even though the entire process felt like a formality dragging out a humiliation that should have already ended the moment Richard walked through the door. He kept his answers short and factual, unwilling to let his frustration bleed into anything the officers might misread as agitation. Melissa gave her account of events to the officers without hesitation, describing exactly what she had seen and heard from the moment Marcus and Zoe first walked through the doors. She spoke clearly and did not soften a single detail, including the moment Vanessa had threatened to fire her for offering to make one simple phone call. Several customers who had recorded the confrontation came forward as well, handing over video that showed exactly what Vanessa had said and done from the moment the check hit the counter to the moment it hit the floor in pieces. A few of them apologized to Marcus directly while they waited, admitting they should have said something the moment the questioning started, instead of only reaching for their phones. One 11-second clip showing Vanessa tearing the check and letting the pieces fall at Marcus's feet while Zoe watched ended up online before the police had even finished taking statements inside the branch. By the time Marcus and Zoe finally left the building that evening, the video already had thousands of views, a number that would multiply many times over before the night was through. Within hours, the clip had spread far beyond Cedar Falls, reaching national attention almost overnight. News vans began appearing outside the Oakview branch before the sun had even fully set, and reporters stood outside the same glass doors Marcus had been walked toward less than a day earlier, asking questions of anyone willing to speak on camera. Reporters quickly discovered that Marcus was a single father who had raised his daughter alone for 6 years, and that the $8 million Vanessa had torn apart was meant to help launch a scholarship fund for children being raised by single parents just like him. Old photographs of Marcus dropping Zoe off at school surfaced online, alongside interviews from neighbors who described him as a quiet, private man who had never once mentioned the size of his company to anyone in Cedar Falls. The contrast between what the money was actually meant to do and how its owner had been treated only deepened the public outrage building around the story with every new share and every new headline. Commentators debated the footage for days, and the phrase Vanessa had used at the counter about people like him not walking in with $8 million was repeated across every major outlet until it became impossible to escape. Local news stations replayed the 11-second clip during every broadcast that week, often followed by panels of guests arguing over what it revealed about how banks treated their customers. A few outlets tracked down Vanessa's previous employment history, uncovering complaints from years earlier that had never made it past an internal file before that week. Sterling Trust's stock began sliding as the video circulated, and the bank's board convened an emergency session that same evening, putting enormous pressure on Richard to do whatever was necessary to keep Marcus from walking away from the $900 million deal. Calls came in from board members who had never once asked about a single branch manager before that afternoon, all of them suddenly desperate to know how quickly the situation could be contained. Richard spent most of that night on the phone fielding questions from executives who cared far more about the falling stock price than about the little girl who had watched her father accused of fraud in front of a room full of strangers. He answered every call the same way, telling them that the only path forward was full accountability, whether or not it was the answer any of them wanted to hear. More than one executive suggested quietly settling with Marcus before the story grew any larger, hoping a private payout might make the entire matter disappear from headlines within a week. Richard refused each time, telling them plainly that Marcus Bennett did not strike him as a man who could be bought into silence, and that trying would likely make things far worse for everyone involved. An internal investigation launched in the following days uncovered a pattern far larger than a single afternoon at a single branch. Vanessa had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers and customers with lower incomes, and previous complaints filed against her had been quietly dismissed by branch leadership long before Marcus ever walked through those doors. Investigators found at least a dozen prior complaints sitting untouched in old files, each one closed without any real review. Employees who had stayed silent about her behavior for years suddenly found themselves being asked why nothing had ever been done. Some admitted they had assumed complaints were being handled above their level. Others confessed they had simply been afraid of losing their own jobs if they challenged a manager's decisions in front of corporate leadership. One former teller who had left the branch nearly 2 years earlier told investigators she had reported an incident almost identical to Marcus's, involving an elderly customer whose account Vanessa had frozen without explanation. That complaint, like the others, had been closed within a week with no further action taken, buried in a file nobody had reason to reopen, until an $8 million check ended up torn on the same lobby floor. What had started as one manager's mistake was quickly becoming proof that an entire system had allowed discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked for years. Within 48 hours, the police formally closed their case, confirming there had been no fraud and no threat of any kind from Marcus, and noting for the record that Vanessa's original report had been false from the start. It was a small measure of official vindication that did little to undo what Zoe had already witnessed. Vanessa lost her job and now faced the possibility of losing her banking license altogether, along with a discrimination lawsuit and a formal charge for filing a false police report. Lawyers representing several of her past customers began reaching out within days, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined. The bank stood to lose the largest financial agreement in its history, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire branch might collapse under the weight of a single torn check and everything it had exposed underneath it. Analysts speculated publicly about whether Sterling Trust could survive the loss of the Bennett Legacy Partners deal on top of the reputational damage already spreading across every major news outlet. Marcus's phone did not stop ringing that first night, filled with messages from reporters, lawyers, and even a few distant acquaintances who had never once called him before but suddenly wanted to know if the rumors were true. He let almost every call go to voicemail, choosing instead to sit with Zoe and let the noise outside their small house in Cedar Falls stay exactly where it belonged, on the other side of a door he had no plans to open that evening. But the sharpest blow of all did not come from the board, the lawyers, or the reporters calling for comment. It came from Zoe later that evening, as she sat across from her father at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. She looked up at him and asked whether anyone would have apologized at all if they had not found out he was rich. Marcus set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment, searching for an answer that would not feel like a lie. He had no answer for her. He had been cleared because he happened to hold power that most people never would, but he understood, sitting there with his daughter's question hanging in the air between them, that thousands of other people walked into banks just like that one every single day without a regional president arriving in time to call them sir. He thought about all the videos and headlines already circulating his name, all the strangers online arguing about what had happened to him, and realized that almost none of them were asking the question Zoe had just asked at their own kitchen table. Everyone wanted to talk about the check. Almost nobody wanted to talk about what happened to the people who did not happen to be carrying one worth $8 million, or the ones who never got a chance to have their names cleared on the evening news. Outside, he could still hear the faint sound of a car slowing near their house, one of several that had crept past since the story broke, drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man everyone online was suddenly talking about. Marcus pulled the curtain shut and turned his attention back to his daughter, the only audience that had ever mattered to him in the first place. For the first time since the check had been torn in half, his own vindication felt entirely hollow to him, and he sat with that feeling long after Zoe had gone quiet, staring at the last uneaten pieces of food on her plate. He reached over and squeezed her hand, unable to give her the honest answer she deserved, and unable to stop thinking about what he might do instead. The lawyers arrived at Marcus's house 3 days later, dressed in suits that looked strangely out of place against the modest porch and the dented pickup truck parked in the driveway. They came with an offer already prepared, one that included a financial settlement, a public apology from the bank, and the termination of several employees, all in exchange for one simple condition. Marcus would sign the $900 million agreement as planned and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Oakview branch. They laid the paperwork out across his kitchen table, the same table where Zoe had asked her question 3 nights earlier, and walked him through the numbers as though the size of the settlement alone might be enough to settle the matter. Marcus let them finish, before he said anything at all. Watching Zoe do her homework quietly in the next room, while grown men discussed how to make a public humiliation disappear from the news cycle, he listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, aware that a single signature from him could still cost Sterling Trust hundreds of millions of dollars and end more than one career at the top of the company. Part of him wanted to walk away entirely, to take Zoe somewhere far from cameras and reporters and never set foot inside another Sterling Trust branch for the rest of his life. He thought about Zoe's question from that first night, the one that had followed him into every quiet moment since. If nobody had known he was rich, would anyone have apologized at all? He understood that punishing Vanessa and pressuring the bank into a public statement would satisfy his own anger, but it would do nothing for the next person who walked into a bank without a regional president waiting nearby to vouch for them. He also thought about the customers who had stood in that lobby with their phones raised, recording everything and saying nothing, and about how easily an entire room had agreed through silence to let an injustice happen in front of them. Punishing one manager would not change that kind of silence. Only something built to outlast the headlines might have a chance. He thought too about Diego's admission that he had known something felt wrong and had not trusted himself enough to act on it, and about how many other employees across the country probably carried that same quiet doubt without ever being given permission to speak it out loud. If the bank walked away from this moment, having only fired one manager, nothing underneath her would have actually changed. The challenge in front of him was no longer proving that an $8 million check was real. It was proving that power, once handed to someone who had felt its absence, could be used to protect the people who never got the chance to hold any of it themselves. Marcus told the lawyers he would keep the deal on the table, but he refused the personal settlement outright, telling them he had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account and everything to do with what happened the next time someone without his last name walked through those doors. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct, conducted by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would require approval from a second manager before it could take effect. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification whenever a dispute arose, rather than being left at the mercy of a single employee's judgment. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition Marcus insisted on directly because of what he had watched happen to Melissa in the middle of that lobby. Frontline staff, including security personnel like Diego, would receive training on when and how to question an order that was clearly wrong, instead of following it simply because it came from someone above them. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted publicly inside every branch in plain language anyone could read while waiting in line. The bank would be required to publicly disclose how it had handled every ignored complaint from the past, including the ones already buried in old files before Marcus ever walked through the doors of the Oakview branch. Finally, Sterling Trust would fund a permanent financial assistance program for single-parent families, seeded with the same money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some of the conditions went far beyond what any single incident required. But with the deal and the company's reputation both hanging in the balance, they had little room left to negotiate. Richard sat through most of those negotiations himself, reminding the board more than once that the cost of refusing Marcus's terms would almost certainly exceed the cost of accepting them. Within the week, every condition had been accepted and written into the final agreement, alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect across every branch in the region. Vanessa's banking license was permanently revoked, and she now faced a civil rights lawsuit alongside the charge for filing a false police report. Employees who had helped bury previous complaints against her were placed under formal review as well, closing out a pattern of silence that had protected her for years longer than it should have. Diego was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage had already shown, that he had never used force against Marcus and had released him the instant he was told to. He was placed into the very training program Marcus had insisted on, learning alongside other staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crossed a clear line. When he saw Marcus again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he had trusted his own instincts sooner instead of waiting for someone else to give him permission to do the right thing. Marcus told him there was nothing left to apologize for, that he remembered clearly how Diego's hand had never once tightened on his arm, and how he had let go the instant Richard spoke. It was a small distinction, but it was one Marcus had carried with him in the weeks since, and he wanted Diego to know it had not gone unnoticed. Melissa was kept on, and promoted to assistant branch manager, a new role that put her in charge of rolling out the teller training program across the entire region, all because she had been the only person in that lobby willing to speak up while everyone else stayed silent. Marcus made a point of thanking her personally before he left the branch that day, telling her that her willingness to say something out loud had mattered more than she probably realized in the moment. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided, and Marcus split the money exactly as he had always planned. $4 million went into the trust, securing Zoe's future. The other $4 million became the seed money for the Bennett Family Scholarship, a program built to support the children of mothers and fathers raising kids on their own, the way he once had. Marcus insisted that the very first round of scholarships be administered out of the Oakview branch itself, the same building that had once refused to believe he belonged there. A place that had turned him and his daughter away would now be the place responsible for handing opportunity to families who looked a great deal like his own. 3 months later, Marcus and Zoe walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same truck and wore the same jacket, unwilling to change anything about himself, simply because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. Zoe held his hand the same way she had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in her grip this time, only the easy comfort of a child walking beside her father on an ordinary errand. The bank, however, looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint or new signage. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help before either of them had said a single word. Nobody's eyes lingered on Marcus's jacket or his truck keys before deciding how he should be treated. And for the first time since that first visit, Zoe did not ask why nobody was helping them yet. A new placard stood near the entrance listing every customer's rights in plain language, along with a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Melissa came over to greet them in her new role, mentioning that the first round of staff training had already rolled out across the entire region and that early feedback from other branches had been better than anyone expected. Diego stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Marcus, he offered a small, genuine nod, a far cry from the tense hesitation Marcus remembered from 3 months earlier. None of the customers who had once stood filming with their phones raised ever came back to that branch again, and Marcus noticed their absence without needing to say anything about it, understanding that some kinds of silence simply chose to stay hidden rather than be confronted. A small plaque near the wall bore the name of the new scholarship fund. At one counter, a young mother was opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Marcus and Zoe had faced that same afternoon, 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Zoe watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her father and asking if that was the reason he had not simply closed the bank down after everything that happened. Marcus thought about it before answering, choosing his words carefully because he wanted her to actually understand them rather than simply hear them. Closing a door is easy, he told her. Making it open for everyone is harder. Zoe nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over in her mind, rather than simply accepting it. She looked back at the young mother at the counter, then up at her father again, as if measuring the distance between the fear she remembered from 3 months earlier and the calm she was watching unfold in front of her now. Before they left, Marcus let Zoe hand the very first scholarship letter to a young student being raised by a single father, watching his daughter's face as she understood, maybe for the first time, that $8 million had never been what made him matter. What mattered was that he had the power to seek revenge, and chose instead to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Father and daughter walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier, a stop at the bookstore, then dinner at the diner on Clover Street. If you had been standing in that lobby the day it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone, or would you have been the first to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $8 million to be treated with basic respect. Marcus did not win the day Vanessa's boss recognized him as a powerful investor standing in his own branch. The real victory only arrived once he used that same power to make sure the next person walking through those doors would be treated fairly, no matter who they were, what they wore, or how much money they carried with them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and carry that same lesson with you. the next time you find yourself standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.